All right, today we wanted to talk a little bit about what you saw in Exodus 34 through 40. So anything surprise you, anything you didn't see before, or just something you thought was interesting?
Did the Egyptians give them that much gold and silver? Because that was a lot.
Apparently. Yeah, we try to picture this. You know, they're getting ready to leave, and all these Egyptians are running up. Here, take this, take this. Oh, here's a basket full of gold. Yeah, just kind of imagine how much they must have given them. And again, that's all God. Right? I don't think it was just out of the goodness of their hearts.
How did gold earn its value?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good economics question. Because it's pretty and it's rare. Why don't we use grass for money?
Yeah.
Why gold? Because it's everywhere. Yeah. So you find that the sparkly things that are rare are what people value. That's a really good question that would require a long answer. Yeah.
How did they move the temple?
The tabernacle.
Yeah, the tabernacle.
It's a tent.
Yeah.
So they would have, it had all these layers of skin and stuff that they just had to tear it down every time they moved. Tear it all apart, compact it, put it into compartments that they could carry. And they would carry it on poles. That's a lot of it. But it's just like when you go camping and you got a tent. Well, this was a huge tent. It had all kinds of parts in it and all kinds of pieces of furniture and stuff. And they would just have to carry it. The priests, the Levites would carry it. That would be a large undertaking, for sure. And you would hope that when you stop and set up, that you're not there just for one night. Wow, we got to tear this down already. Okay, what else? To build it, I don't think it says, and if it doesn't say, I have no idea. It seems like it would take a long time to put all that together. We do know that God appointed certain people to do the artistic stuff and gave them the ability to do it. Okay, anything else? There's something else in there that we should discuss. Yeah, think of that. Okay. All right, let's go to back to Egypt. Remember that what we've been looking at is Israel going to Mount Sinai and what happened there. We've been looking at the last couple of days. And from there, of course, they would head on to the promised land, the land of Canaan. And they would stop before they entered the land and send spies in, 12 spies, one for each tribe, to spy out the land before they go invading and want to find out just what's there. When the spies came back, what kind of report did they give?
Giants.
Yeah, 10 of them said, there are giants in the land. Oh, we can't defeat them. We're like grasshoppers compared to them. So they must have been really big guys, right? By the way, is there any evidence in history of really large people like that? You've probably never seen anything in a museum like that, right? That doesn't mean that the bones haven't been found. They have. But they don't display them. Why? Because it doesn't fit the idea of evolution. There are storage areas, warehouses, all over the country where these large bones have been put away from view. Because that's science. It's estimated from some of these bones that the men from whom those bones came may have been 10, 12 feet tall. And they've been found in different places in the world. So there were giants. All right, so the 10 said, they're giants, we can't defeat them. 2 of them said, yeah, we can. Who are the 2?
Joshua and Caleb.
Right, good. And remember, they brought back large amounts of fruit. Grapes are really big and all that. This is a great place, but there's giants. Now, what did the 10 spies indicate? by saying that. The 10 spies that said we can't go in. What did they indicate? Or what were they showing? Right?
Their lack of faith in God.
Exactly. Because hadn't God told them that he would give them the land? And now they're saying, oh, we can't do it. No, you're right, you can't do it. And Caleb and Joshua said, no, God said he would do it, so let's go. But the people listened to the 10. And they said, we can't go in. So God said to Moses, to tell them, okay, yeah, you're right, you're not going to go in. Because my people are not going to go into the land until this generation dies off. The generation that did not believe that they could go into the land are not going to go into the land. They're going to die off, and the new generation that comes up, they'll be the ones that go in. Except for Joshua and Caleb. They would be allowed to go in. And so they do. In fact, Caleb, I remember, was 80-some years old when they finally got in, because it's 40 years later. And Joshua was the one who led them in. So we have that incident. There's other things that happened there as well. So they wandered for 40 years before finally getting to go into the land from the east. Now, in that interim, Moses does something which prohibits him from going into the land as well. He disobeys God. Do you remember what that was? They were without water again, and they came to the rock, and God told Moses, speak to the rock, and water will come out. But Moses is so ticked at the children of Israel that he says to them, must Aaron and I bring water out of this rock for you? You stubborn people. Well, in the first place, who is it that was bringing the water out of the rock? It was God. It wasn't Moses and Aaron, right? So Moses was taking upon himself what God was really doing in his anger against the people. And so he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. Now, God still provided water. God was gracious in providing water. But he told Moses, because you have disobeyed me in your anger, you're not going to go into the land either. So when he got to the eastern side of the Jordan River, Moses was taken up on Mount Nebo, where he could see the land. So he could see it before him, but he wasn't allowed to enter. He died there on that mountain, and God buried him there. All right, so that's getting them into the land. Now, we want to go back to Egypt and find out what's going on there as the Pharaoh's soldiers, certainly, and maybe Pharaoh himself, were drowned in the Red Sea. So we're talking about Amenhotep Amenhotep II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. And I tend to think that maybe he might have drowned. I don't think the text is clear on this in Exodus, but I think he may have gone in there with his soldiers and drowned. And I'll give you just an anecdotal reason why. There's no real historical reason that I can think of. But when we were in Egypt, we went into the area called the Valley of the Kings. The Valley of the Kings was a place where different pharaohs built their tombs as a place that would be hidden away. Because like in the pyramids and other places, every time they build a tomb, people come and steal the stuff out of it. So in the Valley of the Kings, they would tunnel into the side of the mountain and maybe go in for a while and then down in different directions. And then after they had that all built and the tomb there and the Pharaoh in, they would cover it up and with sand and stuff, and so nobody knew where the tomb was. And so for centuries, people have been finding these tombs, except for one was not found until much later, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But when we were there, you're not allowed to take cameras in. And so I don't have a picture of this, and I did not write it down for certain, but I think, and then they only open up one tomb a day. It might be, you don't know which tomb is going to be open that day when you go in. But I like to think in the providence of God that the tomb that was open that day was Amenhotep II. And I think that was the case. We had to climb up stairs, metal stairs, up to the top of this mountain. And then you go in the opening, and when you go in the opening, then you start going down. And you go down into the mountain. Now, when we went in, I just happened to be in the front of a bunch of some people, and so there was a guy sitting there by the opening who handed me a flashlight, which was kind of handy. It didn't work real well, but it was, it's dark in there. They do have some lights, but it was difficult to see. And I thought he must have thought that I was the leader of this group, and so he gave me a flashlight out of courtesy. You find that nothing is done in Egypt out of courtesy. I'll tell you about that in a minute. So you go down into this tomb, and you're going down, and all along the walls, it's all painted with pictures and hieroglyphics. Really neat. As you're going along, you just wonder about all the work it took to do that. When we got down into the tomb room, and there's no ventilation in there, so it gets hotter and stuffier the further you go. But in that tomb room, it appeared to me that the walls where all the paintings were was unfinished. Like the Pharaoh had died suddenly before they got a chance to finish it all, and they had to bury him. If it was Amenhotep II, that would maybe be a reason to think that maybe he did drown in the Red Sea, because that was would be unexpected, and they maybe had to get him in the tomb before they were able to finish. I don't know if that is reason enough or not, but it could be. Well, then coming out of the tomb, it was so hot and stuffy in there. Coming out into the fresh air, which was 100 degrees, felt like an air conditioner. It was so hot inside that 100 degrees felt cool. So, an amazing adventure.
Well, how would they bury him if he was at the bottom of the sea?
That's a good question. I would think that Pharaoh, I think they would go get him, retrieve his body, I would think. But I hadn't thought about that. But I would suppose that they would go get Pharaoh, because he's God. You got to go get him.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Any other comments, questions? All right. So then we come to the successor of Amenhotep II, who is Thutmose IV, or Thutmoses. You see the name Moses in here. Now, there's something very interesting that occurs with him that I think lends itself to the connections we've made between the different people in the story that we find in Egyptian history and what we find in the Bible, Genesis and Exodus. So follow as I explain this to you. He is the successor of Amenhotep II, and he constructed what's called a dream stela. And this is just a piece of rock that's sticking up and has writing on it. And on this stela, he tells a story. And the story is how when he was a young man, he was hunting in the desert one day when he stopped for a rest between the Sphinx's paws. Now, at that time, much of the Sphinx was covered in sand that had blown in. And he fell asleep. And while he was sleeping, he had a dream in which the Sphinx spoke to him. And it promised him the throne of Egypt in return for clearing the sand from its body. Well, Thutmose went ahead and cleared the sand, and it says on here, the Sphinx then made him king of Egypt. Now, why would he need to have a dream stela in order to convince people that he should be the next pharaoh? And why would the dream Sphinx tell him that he will be the next king of Egypt, or that he would be king of Egypt? Why would that be necessary? Can you think of it?
The people need a reason for making Pharaoh.
What would make it necessary for the people to need a reason to know who the king of Egypt is supposed to be? Exactly. If he was the oldest son of Amenhotep II, would he need this dream stela to convince people that he should be the next king? No, because he's the firstborn. So what does this indicate? This tells us the firstborn was dead. Otherwise, there's no need for somebody else to be a king. And he has this dream stela erected to show people that of all the other sons of Pharaoh, he's the one that should be the next king. You follow? So I think this fits in with the narrative very well too. So even if you go from here backwards, you can see that everything along the line has fit in very nicely with what we have in the Bible compared to Egyptian history. You agree? All right, although Thutmose the Fourth ruled for a short time, I'm sorry, for only 9 years, the mummy shows that he was still quite young when he died. It's thought that given the evidence of the stela that the young prince would have been the younger brother whose older brother died before he could inherit the throne. So even secular historians recognize that, although they don't make the connection with Exodus like we do. Here is a picture of the dream stela, its location. It's kind of hard to see here, it's just kind of a shadow, it looks like. And this, these are the legs of the Sphinx. So it's put right there. All right, any questions? All right, we come to the next guy, and that is Amenhotep III. Amenhotep, or I should say, Amenhotep III. Amenhotep, the big thing that happened during his reign is that in recent years there was found a list that goes back to his reign, what we call a topographical list. It's a list of countries or areas. And in this list, which was found in the Temple of Amen in Nubia, in this list there is written these letters, which don't mean anything to you, but translated it's saying Uwe or Yahweh of the land of the Shasu. Now in ancient times, oftentimes a country or a land would be called by the name of the god of that land. And so they're calling this land Yahweh because he's the god of that land. Of course, they're talking about what we would call the land of Canaan or Israel as has been established. So during the reign of the second Pharaoh after the Exodus, we find evidence that that land already was being called Yahweh. And this is the first clear extra-biblical evidence of the name Yahweh. So the first time outside the Bible that the name Yahweh is used. All right, any questions? Yeah.
So is the temple of Ammon the name of
No, that's where it was found.
Oh,
Yeah, you don't need to know that. That's just up there for information. Okay, so Amenhotep apparently decided to name his son after him. The next guy is Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep IV, his name Amenhotep means Amen is pleased, although he would change his name later, as we'll see. Yes?
So this is the new kingdom?
This is still the New Kingdom. We started with the New Kingdom back while after the Israelites have been enslaved, or they've been enslaved at the beginning of the New Kingdom, when the Hyksos were driven out. That's the beginning of the New Kingdom. So this is a New Kingdom continuing on. All right, it's the longest period of any of the kingdom ages, I think. Or at least the most happens. All right, so Amenhotep IV was apparently the co-regent of Amenhotep III. Sometimes father and son ruled together, kind of make the transition more easy. But it's interesting, Amenhotep IV isn't mentioned in the records at all until he actually becomes king. He changed 3 pillars of Egyptian society. First of all, he changed religion and changed his name to Akhenaten, which means it's beneficial to Aten, who is Aten is a minor sun god. It's sort of Ra, but another name in a local area. And so Amenhotep IV tried to change the religion of Egypt to worshiping just Aten. And so he's known as the heretical king of Amarna, because he attempted to bring all the other gods under the authority of Aten. But the worship of Aten never penetrated to the masses of Egypt. They were a long time worshiping many gods. They weren't going to change over to one. And this brought about religious civil war because, you know, the priests of all these different temples weren't going to give up either. And so there was conflict between all the priests and against Akhenaten. Akhenaten is just holed up in his city, which leads us to the second pillar of Egyptian society to change, and that was Pharaoh, the place of Pharaoh himself. Akhenaten moved the capital from Thebes to Amarna, which is a city that he built under the direction of Aten. The god Aten showed him where to build the city, and he did. And he said he would never leave the city. He was totally dedicated to Aten. And so he didn't leave the city. And that changed the perception of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was supposed to be the king over all the land of Egypt. Well, how do you do that if you just stay stuck in this one city the whole time? And how do you do that if you're worshiping one god and everybody else is worshiping many gods? So he isolated himself from everybody. The third pillar of Egyptian society that he changed was the military. The Egyptians always considered that the gods had favored them with a strong military so that they could be on top of all the other nations. But Akhenaten just was staying in his one city. He wasn't concerned with conquering other nations or ruling over other nations. And so he had no interest in that. And so the military declined under his rule. So those are three pillars of Egyptian society that dramatically changed under the rule of Akhenaten: is the religion, the idea of the pharaoh himself, and the military. And so the gradual decline of the new kingdom begins here. A rebellion spread through Syria, Palestine, up in the area of the land of Canaan where Israel is. In that area, they began to rebel against Egypt because Egypt had not had much of a presence there in some time anyway. And so it just continued to get worse. During this time, there were found some letters called the Amarna letters. In 1887, an Egyptian peasant woman discovered a collection of cuneiform tablets at the site of Akhenaten's capital from the 14th century BC. There were a total of 377 tablets found. Later, more tablets were found. About half of them were written in Akkadian by Canaanite scribes in Palestine, describing the condition there. One major problem they talk about was the Hapiru, who were taking over the land. The Hapiru, that sounds awful close to Hebrew. They wanted the king of Egypt to send reinforcements. The Hapiru is generally used as a term for robber or migrant, but it is also very similar to the spelling of Hebrew. Now, why couldn't Amenhotep IV send an army up there to help the Hapiru? To fight against the Hapiru? Well, remember what happened back in the Red Sea? They lost a lot of their army. And they were weak after that. And then you've got Akhenaten, who doesn't want to conquer anything. And so the army has become much smaller and not as effective. Now think about this. The Hebrew people, the children of Israel, are invading the land of Canaan. The cities that are there had been under Egyptian rule for a long time. But now all of a sudden the Egyptians aren't there so much anymore. And so they're calling for help from the Egyptians. Send some troops to help us defend against these Hebrews. But they don't come. Why? Because a large number of them are down in the Red Sea. So we think about the drowning of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea just in relationship to the children of Israel escaping, right? We think they're escaping and Pharaoh's army comes after them and the Red Sea drowns them. It saves the Hebrew people at that point. What we don't often think about is 40 years later, when they're invading the land, that again, the Egyptian army could have come up there and battled them and kept them from coming into the land, but they didn't because many of them had been drowned. So the drowning of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea not only saved the Hebrews right then, but also 40 years later, because they weren't there to come and fight against them. You see that? So God's providence, sometimes we see one thing as a result of what he does. But what we don't often think about is, okay, how did that affect things later? Or even later than that. All right, so something cool to think about. Here's a picture of the Amarna letters. Let me read you a couple portions from these. From the city of Gezer, this comes. Now the Hippiru are prevailing over us. So may the king, my lord, take me away from the land of the Hippiru, so that the Hippiru will not destroy us. In other words, get me out of here. Another place says, may the king, my lord, be informed that war is waged in the land, and that that the land of the king, my lord, is being ruined by going over to the Hippiru. All right, so during the administration of Amenhotep IV, the authority of the priests, officials, and soldiers were growing while the monarchy was weakening. And that goes back to Akhenaten. He kind of set the ball rolling on that. One thing that could be said about Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, is he did make a good choice of a wife. He's married to the beautiful Queen Nefertiti, considered one of the most beautiful women in history. Amenhotep IV also changed art. Prior to this, whenever pharaohs built statues of themselves, the head might look like them, but the body was that of a muscle builder. It was somebody who looked really buff, six-pack abs, looked really strong. And so we can probably figure that most of the pharaohs didn't really look like that, at least when they were old. But Akhenaten changes that. When he builds a statue of himself, it looks like him. He didn't put himself on a really good body. As you can see here in this statue, there he is, little pot gut and everything. No, it doesn't look all that great. And if that's realistic and the statue of his wife is realistic, it's hard to tell from here, but apparently she was a very beautiful woman. All right, any questions? Oh, I got to tell you how he died. I referenced this earlier. We were talking about the way people died in Egypt a lot. Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, died as a result of a tooth infection. He had an abscessed tooth, became infected, and eventually that infection killed him. That's why it's important. That's why we're so fortunate today that we can get an antibiotic for those things. Because otherwise, those minor infections that we get sometimes, we get an antibiotic, drives it out. In earlier centuries, was fatal. All right, following Amenhotep IV is his son-in-law, Semenkhkare. Maybe that's how you say it. And nothing much to say about him. Following him, however, is a guy that you have heard of, King Tutankhamun, commonly known as King Tut. How many have heard of King Tut? All right, almost everybody. All right, he is the next pharaoh. He begins ruling at the age of 10, but he apparently dies at the age of 19. So he didn't live very long. The important thing he does is he restores the old forms of worship. He brings Egypt back to polytheism. He gets rid of the one God idea and comes back to worshiping many gods. Now, there's a lot of speculation as to how he died, since he died at such a young age. Why? Well, the assumption is if he died at 19, he probably was killed. It wasn't natural causes. But there's been little proof of that. However, a book written by James Patterson, I think, really helps us. Anybody ever read anything by James Patterson? He's a mystery writer, adventure writer. He writes about spies and adventure stuff. Really good writer. But he decided that the greatest mystery in history was the mystery of King Tut. And so he wrote a book, which I think is entitled The Murder of King Tut. And in this book, he chronicles the life of King Tut, what we know from history, and then he speculates the things in between. And then he switches back and forth between that and Howard Carter, who is the one who discovered the tomb of King Tut and the adventures he went through. So it's a very interesting book as he goes back and forth between the two. And he provides what I think is compelling evidence that King Tut was killed by one of his generals, and who then took over. And he is the next pharaoh by the name of Ai, or A. See, he only rules for 4 years. I think he was older when he took over, with the help of Horemheb, who then became the next pharaoh. And we'll talk about them and go back and see a song about King Tut tomorrow.